Good morning. I just wanted to give you a little history about this. The information that Bill is going to present, we were actually able to make possible through a grant. We decided to make our first grant application a little over a year ago, and there was some funds available through the Department of Agriculture and the Economic Development Corporation called the Strategic Growth Initiative. And so we worked with Bill, and we actually worked with the Lansing Economic Ag Partnership, went in and presented that grant. After we presented, we got called in by MDA, and they asked us if they couldn't give us more money than we requested, which is pretty awesome, if we could make it a statewide project instead of just a regional project. So we're not done at this point, but we wanted to have Bill in to share with you the exciting things that he's found and kind of give you a quick overview and let you know what we've learned so far. So with that, Bill, I'm going to turn it over to you. It looks like you're all set and ready.
Okay, real briefly, paper's going to go over kind of the background, kind of talk a little bit about the situation with the U.S. wheat market, a little bit about the situation in the Michigan wheat market as well, then look a little bit about the market for different wheat-based products. As you guys probably know, wheat's used for just about anything that isn't meat or dairy. That's the good news. The bad news is that they all tend to be substitutes for one another. So growing the overall market may be difficult, although there does seem to be some individual opportunities in certain market areas or certain product areas. And we're going to talk about some preliminary results and some next steps. The project will probably be finished around June or so. The idea is to give you kind of a current state of the industry and determine the areas that have the most potential for wheat producers and the entire wheat supply chain. Professor Hooker kind of talked about the situation in Canada. The situation in the U.S. is similar. Over time, for a number of different reasons, wheat acres are losing out to corn and soybean acres. And that kind of gives you some idea of what's happened with the U.S. wheat acres. We've gone from about 62 million acres down to 56 million. If you look at the situation in 2010, it kind of dipped below 54 million acres. And it's kind of hard sometimes to compete, when corn gets up to $6, $7 a bushel, it gets kind of hard to compete. Also talked about, the previous speaker also talked about the yield situation, the fact that yields, they're going up, but they aren't going up as fast as corn or soybeans, and that's an issue. It's hard to believe, but it's true. The amount of research and development, both public and private sector, for wheat, despite the fact that it's in the U.S. at least it's a food grain, has not kept up with the research and development, both public and private sector, in corn and soybeans. All right, one thing that I found, one initial finding that I found quite interesting, and when I start doing interviews with supply chain participants, I want to spend a lot more time talking about, is this concept, are there really multiple wheat markets? And the conventional wisdom is that you've got different varieties of wheat going to different types of products. But if you look at what happens with the actual wheat prices, they tend to move together. So there could be some level or potential to substitute between different classes of wheat. And this is kind of a messy slide, so I'll try to take a few minutes talking about this. This is different varieties of the prices of different varieties of wheat from 2000 to 2014, I think. And you start down here in the late 1990s, early part of 2000. Well, things are pretty lousy. And what you see here, the different classes are closely clumped together, and that's probably because who was really buying the wheat was the U.S. government. The price was being set by the U.S. government. You got to increase. You got two kind of booms here. One in the kind of mid to late 2000s, and then the other in the early 2010. But still, with one possible exception, they seem to be moving pretty close together. Also, the spring wheats, the hard red spring wheat seems to be doing quite well compared to the other ones. And the soft red winter does do a little worse than white. But again, if you look at especially these last few years, the prices are beginning to converge again. The outlier seems to be durum, especially in the last year or two, where the price of durum's gone up, but the price of the other classes of wheat's gone down. But again, I think the fundamental takeaway from this slide is that despite the discussion of the different classes of wheat and the different uses and the different markets for the different classes of wheats, the prices tend to move together, which tells me that the millers and the manufacturers have figured out a way to substitute different classes of wheat for one another, with the possible exception of durum. Wheat exports are an important part of the wheat market. About half the wheat produced in the U.S. is exported on any given year. For the white winter wheat, it's about 2/3. Now, most of that white winter wheat that gets exported is grown out west, and that primarily goes to Asia. Michigan's kind of an outlier in that most of the white winter wheat produced in Michigan stays right here for some specialty products, not the least of which is breakfast cereals. The difficulty, one issue is that good export numbers on a state level are difficult to determine. What the USDA does is says, okay, here's the total amount of wheat, here's the total amount of wheat exports, and let's say Michigan produces 5% of the wheat in the country, then 5% of, then half of that 5% is assumed to be exported, whether or not that's really the case or not. So getting good hard numbers on wheat exports is difficult. Unlike the U.S. as a whole, it's rather interesting that the production or the wheat acreage in Michigan has been very stable, right around 600,000 acres a year. Get some variation, but there isn't a precipitate downward trend in Michigan that you see in other states. And it's kind of interesting. I'm doing giving another presentation tomorrow. We're looking at land values. Land values, as you probably know, are softening. They've gone down 2% this year in Michigan, but they've gone down 4% in Indiana and Illinois, and they've gone down 5% in Iowa. So having some diversity in your crop enterprises seems to help moderate your land values or your decline in your land values. In Michigan, yields have been trending up. From 2009 to 2013, yields increased from 68 bushels an acre to about 75 bushels an acre. Again, this is something we want to look into in a little bit more detail. It may be due to farmers getting out of the white varieties and into the red varieties. You guys are also getting smarter and becoming better managers. That probably has something to do with it as well. This is a slide that Jody added to the presentation, which I think is very helpful. Michigan is the 8th largest wheat producer in the country. 1993, 70% of the acreage went into white winter wheat. 2011, it was 40%. So you guys have kind of flipped it around. Michigan has a much higher yield than the average in the U.S. Part of that, again, is because you grow winter varieties, and winter varieties do a lot better than spring varieties in terms of yields. I know weather is a constant frustration, but the weather here is still somewhat more predictable than it is on the plains, which is the other major wheat growing area, so that also helps. Okay, this is kind of a busy slide. I'll try to go over this. This kind of gives you some idea of what's the value of some of the wheat-based industries in the state. And this is production of wheat-based processing. The one that sticks out like a sore thumb again is, and this isn't all wheat-based products, but breakfast cereals is a billion dollar industry in the state. Another big one is bread production and frozen cakes and pies. Again, the pie and cake industry uses a lot of the varieties of wheat that are grown in Michigan. One industry that I would think that you're going to want to keep an eye on is this one down here, the tortilla business. 20% of the population is now Hispanic, and they use a tortilla-based diet, and that's both corn and wheat-based tortillas. So overall, wheat-based processing is a $2 billion industry in the state, and these figures are somewhat old. I believe they're from the 2007 economic census, so if anything, these numbers have gone up. These are the previous slide showed you the size of the industry in terms of sales. These are the number of businesses, and they're individual locations. So, for example, a bakery, a bread baker may have 5 or 6 different bakeries throughout the state for fresh delivery. These are individual factories or individual processing facilities. You'll notice that retail bakeries are the biggest. And the question, one of the questions I think we want to dig into further detail is how much of an interest do these retail bakeries have in using locally sourced products? Because the local food movement is probably the single biggest demand driver in the food industry right now. As I mentioned at the very beginning, wheat's used for a lot of different things. This kind of gives you some ideas. One thing that I wanted to focus on is how close substitutes a lot of these things are for one another. Again, breakfast cereals are going to compete against breakfast bars. Cakes, cookies, and pies are going to compete against baking and dessert mixes. Bread, rolls, and biscuits, they're all substitutes for one another. And adding to this, they're all mature markets. So the growth of the overall wheat consumption or space in a person's stomach is constrained in the U.S. by the population growth and income growth. And so if you're looking at increasing consumption in the U.S., one of your biggest drivers of that increased consumption is going to be immigration. We're just not having children like we used to, and so who's going to make up that difference? Who's going to grow that market? Especially for these mature products, and that could be immigrants. Okay, what sectors seem to have the most promise? Or what product attributes are consumers looking for? I mentioned locally produced, so that's one big mover. Another one is this whole grain idea. Non-GMO is a big consideration for a certain group of consumers, and it's particularly for food-based products. Consumers seem less worried about GMOs that are used for animal feed or GMO feed products. Again, this idea of carbohydrates, good carbs versus bad carbs, complex carbohydrates being good for you, simple carbohydrates being not so good for you. So there are ways to position wheat products, despite all this talk about gluten intolerance and whatnot out there. There are a lot of ways to position wheat products to appeal to the demand driver of health. And health is another major demand driver. The beer industry. Being in East Lansing, you can't not talk about beer. So many of our students are connoisseurs of it. There are over a couple of hundred brew pubs, microbreweries in the state, and they're having a hard time accessing barley. And there's a real interest in using wheat. It's probably the best known craft beer in the state is Bill's Oberon. That's a wheat-based beer. Some other breweries like Shorts are spending a lot of time and effort on wheat-based beer. So wheat beer seems to be one area of growth. I think in-store bakeries, again, the idea of something that's fresh, something made from scratch, something that's produced locally is another potential way to grow demand in Michigan. Another thing is, what can you do with the entire wheat plant? We've kind of focused on the grain. Can you develop additional products for wheat germ? What's going on with wheat midds in Michigan? And this is something that we're still talking about on campus. Even though the price of oil is extremely low, there still seems to be an abiding interest in substitute products for petroleum or for petroleum-based inputs. And can you use fibers from wheat straw, for example, and other products as well, miscanthus or switchgrass or whatever, to make industrial products, primarily as a substitute for fiberglass and other things. We're spending a lot of, the auto industry remains interested in this, and so this is going to be one additional area of analysis for the final version of the paper. Next steps, again, we're going to conduct interviews with some supply chain participants. That means some of you are going to get calls. I'll try to be quick and short to the point, not take up too much of your time. Also to really spend some time looking at some level of interest for industrial applications. I'm hoping to get this done by June 1st. Book's solid basically through April, so I'm hoping that I can get a lot of stuff done in May. Hard to say, but that's kind of my timeline. Wow, we're back on time. I've got 3 minutes for questions and.
If brewers are having trouble getting barley, just pay us for the brew.
Well, there's a lot of research being done right now on barley, particularly up in the UP and in northern lower Michigan. There's some issues with handling barley as far as it's such a small crop. The elevators don't seem all that interested. We're also trying to develop a bigger malting industry in the state. There are 3 malt houses, basically, and this is basically the 3rd chapter of the report. We talk about the different supply chains. The supply chain for wheat that goes into beer is considerably different than wheat that goes into a flour mill. So it's got to go to a malt house, and we need either one big malt house or a couple of more smaller malt houses. I guess that's it. Thank you very much. Appreciate your time.